And we're live.
Hello, Tim and Kirsten. I'm excited. You know what? I'm excited because we showed up today as we are, as we were talking before the broadcast, and I thought, you know what? This is as real as it gets. We're good.
This is authenticity, 100%.
Yes, it is. Wet hair, fresh from the shower. I'm in my bedroom. Doesn't get more real than this.
Kirsten, I'm with you. I already told you. I'm like, you know what? I'm too tired. I'm not doing makeup. My light is making me look like I'm in jail. We're good. It's about what we say. It's about who we are.
As you can see, we're all very much into the visual side of things on this show. Not like we do a live video show or anything. So, Kirsten, can you first off just give everybody that little kind of elevator pitch to what do you do and how has obviously I suspect the whole COVID thing has slightly affected you. So talk a little bit about that as well. Yeah.
Well, my name is Kirsten. I go by Kirsten Alana pretty much everywhere online, or Kirsten Alana Photography. I am coming to you live from Los Angeles right now, which is where I currently live, but I've lived in half a dozen US states. I was born in Vermont, very proud to have been born there. It's an incredible state on the East Coast if you haven't yet been. For photographers, especially in spring and fall and winter, it's absolutely gorgeous. Or I should say summer, fall, and winter. Vermont really only has mud season. But anyway, and I've lived a lot of places since then. I was nomadic for 4 years. I've traveled to all 50 states and 60 plus countries. I started my travel photography career specifically back in more than 10 years ago, let's just put it that way. And before that, I was a wedding and portrait photographer. I did that part-time, so I also had other jobs while I was doing that. And I kind of call myself a Jill of all trades sometimes because my career has allowed me to have my hands in everything a little bit, from marketing and social media to obviously photography to blogging. I have 2 websites that I run. So yeah, that's me in an elevator pitch, which I need to perfect because it's a little bit all over the place and slightly different every time I tell that story, but there you go.
As I said to somebody, how many times have you had to sell yourself to an elevator anyway? Let's face it.
Right. I like the way you put that.
Yeah.
I have so many questions I want to ask you, and I think I'm going to start with Tim's hold on, Tim. I have so many questions, but I want to start with, I think so many of us want to be able to travel and take pictures or do a vlog. How do you make it happen?
A lot of elbow grease, a lot of, not giving up, a lot of persistence. If you Google, how to make a travel blog or how to be a travel photographer, there are so many resources online that I've never published any on my own websites because I tend to like to push people towards my colleagues. It's just a way that I can kind of, I guess, give back, and I lose out on that traffic. But, there are so many people who have written courses on this, and I think it differs for each and every one of us, which is another aspect, in that no 2 people who ever come to me for that kind of advice are ever going to have the same path as I did or the same path as the other person who asks. So it's a very individual journey. But for me, I was a wedding and portrait photographer, like I said before, and I really wanted to transition out of that into travel photography, which was something that I had, thought about most of my life, but always sort of not really believed was a path open to me. I didn't have people around me encouraging me to do that. But then I went through this divorce and I really didn't want to be the divorced wedding photographer. And I was on Twitter and Facebook, and I started to kind of follow and interact with people who were doing the types of jobs that I wanted to do, travel writers, other travel photographers, people who had blogs. I already had a blog as a wedding and portrait photographer, so I was already a blogger. But I basically, through interacting with people on social media, I just began to make contacts, began to get to know people in the industry. And my first ever job was a travel writer that was in the state I was living in at the time. And he wanted a photographer for the article that he was writing. And I did photos for that article, got my little byline in the newspaper with him, which is so funny because so few people I actually know write for newspapers anymore. And, newspapers are sort of changing. And so that one job led to more. I transitioned my wedding and portrait photography blog to a travel blog and started publishing stories about my travels. And then next thing you know, I was getting hired as a blogger, and it all spiraled from there. I really never made a good business plan, which is something I would recommend you not do. Make a business plan, have goals. I really followed one open door to the next open door to the next, and here we are 10 plus years later. So I would not recommend doing it the way that I've done it, but that's one way you could.
Yeah, and everyone's path is different. Like you said, I think I've talked to quite a few people who do travel, make money, and they do it. Everyone is different. Some are working on the side and you just don't know. Some make money from their blogs. So you're right. Everyone has that different path. How has COVID, how has lockdown and the current situation affected what you do?
It's been really tough. I mean, I basically didn't travel for more than a year. I know a lot of people who did travel during the pandemic. And for me, that was a choice that I made because for me, I felt like caring about the individual populations where I might travel was a little more important. And, you know, COVID was something that none of us had dealt with before. It was incredibly new. So while there was a lot written by the travel industry about, you know, hey, if we're open, you should still come visit because our tourism industry needs you, the science of how safe that was or not was inconclusive to me for most of the pandemic. I really didn't feel that for me as a traveler, that the risk of the health aspect of it was worth the payoff for like helping keeping economies afloat by physically being there in person. So I tried to support the places that I love just online with posting about them and reminding people that those locations would still be there when we were ready to travel again. You know, countries like Germany and Scotland and France and, you know, my favorite countries on the continent of Africa and India. So places that I loved, I supported them by talking about them online instead of physically going to those places. And eventually, you know, I realized that I was fully vaccinated now and maybe it was time to travel again. So actually this month I just did my first assignment back since the pandemic began, and I was up in Napa Valley shooting for a bunch of wine brands, which is sort of a travel adjacent, you know, that's more lifestyle and wine industry work, but nonetheless it's getting back to work. And then this coming weekend actually will be my first trip out of the state of California since this all began, which is the longest I've been in any one place since I began my career. It was definitely an adjustment, a little bit of a kind of personality conflict. You know, who am I if I'm not a traveler? So this coming weekend, I'm headed to Hawaii, and then I'll finally get to see my family later on this month, who I haven't seen since August 2019. So again, you know, my path may be different than others, but this was the way that felt the right thing for me. And here we go. It's going to be interesting.
I'm going to ask one of my kind of weird, wide-ranging question, but if you like were only allowed to take 5 photographs from around the entire world, of places you've been, and that would be what you'd be remembered by, what would those 5 places be? And I'm kind of putting the caveat they can't all be in the same country because
that's fair.
It could be annoying.
I think, you know, there are 2 photographs that kind of always come to mind. I always tell people I'm not an award-winning photographer because I never submit myself to award things. I'm not the world's best photographer. I might not even be everyone's favorite photographer. I am who I am, and I'm very different. And so the first 2 photos that come to mind aren't actually of people. The first one is Tanzania, and I went there on assignment with 4 Seasons during the Great Migration, which is something that I absolutely recommend everyone experience once in their lifetime if they can. It is truly one of the most incredible things you could experience as a human being because you understand the smallness of your place in the world and how much there is on this planet that's just not about you. And when you see so many animals en masse living out, you know, part of their survival story, it's so different from ours as human beings, obviously, but there it is. And you're literally seeing it from the ground and from the air. So one of my favorite photos is from a sunrise hot air balloon journey over the Serengeti at sunrise with all these zebras on the ground below us. And I'm shooting from one hot air balloon and there's another hot air balloon in the photo. And I was a Samsung image logger at the time when Samsung was making physical cameras, not just their phones. Yeah. And so that photo was used by Samsung. I share it all the time still as one of my favorite travel photos. And it's just the light, the experience, all of that just makes it one of my favorite photos I've ever taken. And another one in Scotland, up in Glencoe, which is, so historical and so talked about when it comes to people talking about Scotland. But it's just the memory in particular. We were doing a photo tour with a local Scottish photographer, and he was explaining how he would shoot the scene and giving advice. And then I captured the scene too. And it's at sunset. The light is just beautiful. The little white cottage that I think is part of the hiking association in that area is in the photo. And then there's a river. And I just love that photo. I love the light. I love Scotland. It's one of my favorite places I can go to. So there's that emotional attachment to it. I think another one would have to be one of the portraits of people that I've taken when I'm in India. I always have such a wonderful time there now. My first ever experience in India wasn't the best, but every trip since then has really been incredible. And it's because of the people. They really make that country special. And yes, there are colors and textures and there's history and there's lots of things to entertain a photographer. But for me, the people that I meet when I'm there are the most special. So it would have to be one of those portraits. And let's see, I've got two more and I'm talking, this is long already. So what would be another one? Yeah, that's tough. I'm going to start to struggle after that. Let's go with probably a photo from Morocco. It's such a photogenic country, just like India. The colors, the textures, the history again. Also the people again. I think I would probably pick something from Casablanca or Fez, Rabat, or maybe Marrakesh. You can't go wrong as a photographer in Morocco. There's not really a really bad photo to take. So definitely something from there. We haven't given Asia or South America any love, but I will be very honest that I've struggled to really love South America and Asia. I just haven't connected with them in the same way that I connect with Africa and Europe. So let's just go with Thailand. I feel like that's another country that's really beautiful, and that was a little bit easier for me to connect to than China, which I kind of struggled with. Thailand, there's so many beautiful temples. The people, again, are so welcoming and so kind, and I really did have a really good experience there when I was on assignment with Four Seasons and the private jet that went around the world. So probably something from that trip, and I think that makes 5.
Yeah,
I love it.
Just do the private jet, I think, for most people would be like,
I would recommend that.
Yeah.
That's awesome. You mentioned Thailand, and I'm a little bit intrigued because I've noticed that there's a lot of expats in Thailand and a lot of travel vloggers in Thailand, and I'm not quite sure why that is. Do you know why?
It's an inexpensive country, so when you are what a lot of people call a digital nomad, when you literally, live out of your bags and you do your work all around the world, it ends up being pretty cost effective for a lot of people to base themselves for a long time. I get the feeling that might be changing as, Asia kind of rises in the world and as currencies change. I don't know that it'll be as cheap as it has been for as long as we might want it to be, but I do think it's fairly inexpensive for a lot of expats and their dollar goes far, especially if they're making, Australian, Canadian, US or UK currency. So I think that has a lot to do with it. And it is also a wonderful country. It's basically warm all year round. It basically has everything you would want, from cool cities to great beaches to mountain towns and everything else. So yeah, it's very, very popular with digital nomads and photographers and bloggers.
And it's near places you can travel quite easily, I would imagine. It's easy to hop out and be near other places you can quickly take pictures or videos, I would suppose. Living in Los Angeles, have you had a chance to do any photography in your own city?
Yeah, absolutely. One of my favorite places to go is the Griffith Observatory, especially at sunset. If you stay long enough, you see the lights come on both in Los Angeles downtown and then also Century City. And you see the city spread out before you with all the lights. You can see the planes landing at LAX in the distance. So it's a beautiful place to just observe the city. And then also the Griffith Observatory itself is I really stumble over that phrase, Griffith Observatory. Anyways, the architecture of the building itself is very cool. For nerds like me, there's a Tesla coil inside, which I just absolutely geek out about. So that's really fun, but I would caution tourists and visitors that it is absolutely packed with crowds. So I am by no means the only person who loves going there. It is very much a tourist attraction, unfortunately. So, plan your visit accordingly. probably park at the bottom of Griffith Park and then hike up to the observatory is probably the best way to do that. There are also buses that will take you from the bottom of the park up to the observatory, because once you get to where the observatory is, the parking is a nightmare and it's very hard to find a spot. Yep. I also really love Huntington Gardens and Descanso Gardens. They're two, open to the public gardens that started as private gardens a very long time ago. There's a cultural element to both of them that's very cool, with plants from around the world, architecture from around the world. I'm definitely a nature, flower, plant person. That's one of the things that I never get tired of photographing. I do really love downtown LA for photos. There's some cool architecture. You've got the grit of street photography for other photographers. There's great places to eat. You're definitely going to meet colorful characters. There's a lot of history there too. The Bradbury Building has been featured in many Hollywood movies. That's downtown, and I really love that. There's also the Arts District, which has really great street art to photograph and to enjoy. Lots of great eateries to walk around and lots of good shopping. I like the beach too. I don't really love Santa Monica or Venice because of the crowds, but the Venice canals are really beautiful to photograph. It's so funny how often I have to clarify for people online, no, not Venice, Italy. There's a Venice here in California. They don't look anything alike. And yet still when people see Venice canals, they think, oh, that must be Italy. So that's a really kind of fun place to go, but you're going to compete with tourists there. I tend to try and escape the crowds, and we go north up the coast and we go to Point Dume, which is sort of part of the greater Malibu area. And there's seals there and sea lions, and you always see whales off the coast and sometimes dolphins. So I really love going there to both photograph it and to just escape into that natural environment. There's a really nice hike you can do along the cliffs. And I could keep going, but those are probably the highlights.
Yeah. We live in such a gorgeous part of the world. We can do staycations like no other.
Yeah.
And so
it's true.
San Diego and LA are like one of the most visitable places in the US. So
they really are.
Really.
Yeah.
Shall we I was going to ask a broader question about travel. So let's assume the world is opened up. What would be kind of like, what is the place in the world that you visited that you most enjoyed that you didn't expect to enjoy?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I think that, what would that be? Oh, I'm going to give a shout out to my friend Monica in Romania. I stopped there again on an assignment, private jet experience, where I was the onboard photographer for the guests and staff for the jet itself. And I had no expectations, because Monica and I had met when we were both living in New York, and then she'd moved back to Romania. And so when she found out I was coming to town, we both kind of said at the same time, well, we have to get together when I wasn't working. And so, I finished my assignments for the day, and then she and I went to some of the beer gardens and the bars in Bucharest, Romania. Yes.
Yeah.
It's amazing how many times you can confuse Budapest and Bucharest, even though you know the difference, but they're just such similar words. So Monica took me around Bucharest, Romania. For the assignment itself, we got to go to some of the rural areas in Romania. And I really was just shocked by how much I love that country. I really want to go back and see Monica again and explore more of Romania, go up to some of the castles that have sort of made the country famous. And the people were great. The food was wonderful. That was just a really unexpected love for me. I would say that I had zero expectations. I knew I might like it, but I didn't think I'd love it. And I walked away absolutely loving it.
You're the first place that you go outside of this country as soon as borders open, because there's still a lot of borders that are closed.
Yeah,
where would you like to go?
I really want to go to Scotland and France. Those are my two favorite places, kind of period. I have a lot of friends in both. I've just connected with lots of different aspects, from, the people that I meet there and the friends I have, to the food and the landscapes and some of the culture and the history. I always preface that no country is perfect, so I don't believe Scotland or France are perfect, but I really love visiting those, and so I'm aching to get back to them. And I really want to go to some of the parts of both of those countries that I still haven't been to. Even though I've been many times, there are still so many areas I haven't explored at all. And so I'd love to get back to that. But I also really want to go to Japan and New Zealand. I've not been to either of those at all, not even once, not even to the airport. So, living here on the West Coast, Christelle, those are sort of closer for us than they were in New York. So I'm really hoping that finally happens now that I've been here a while, and hopefully I can get a flight deal or something and finally get to Japan and New Zealand.
Yeah. So, well, we could talk about travel all day.
Okay.
Unfortunately,
Oh, I
we have time limits. But let's talk a bit about photography and travel photography. Presumably, you're using some sort of camera rather than just doing phone photography. Is that true?
Correct.
What was your progression in terms of, or what would your advice be in terms of kit and stuff for people who want to do better travel photography, mainly, presumably more amateur, but maybe they want to become travel photographers?
It's a great question. And I've shot with pretty much every brand under the sun. The only one that I've never really felt like I loved was Nikon. And if you talk to, any 10 professional photographers, there's always going to be a joke about Canon versus Nikon and going to the dark side. And everybody has their opinion on which is which. I started my career with Canon. And actually, I should say I started my career with film cameras way back in the day. I literally had a bag of rolls of film on my hip at every wedding. And you always panicked that you were going to be on the last exposure at a moment that was crucial and you were going to miss it while you were changing the roll of film. That was very stressful. I do not miss that. I know a lot of photographers are going back to film, and there's really a movement for that. I enjoyed printing my own photos. I enjoyed the darkroom experience. I really miss that sometimes. But in terms of doing film photography as a career, I don't miss that stress of, am I going to run out of film? Is this exposure not even going to work? Is something going to go wrong with the roll in the camera? So I would only do that as a hobby now. And I think for very special scenarios, although I do know some great film photographers. Marcus Lloyd out of New York is one of my personal favorites. He uses the same CMS that I do for my photo blog, which is called Exposure. So if you Google Marcus Lloyd, he just absolutely does wonderful things with different kinds of film and film cameras. But more recently, I've tested with pretty much everyone under the sun. Like I mentioned earlier, I was part of the Samsung Image Logger group. I tested cameras for Fuji, Olympus, Sony. And right now I shoot with Sony gear, the A7R II and III. I'd really like to get my hands on the A7R IV. Just need to upgrade. And I tend to shoot for travel. When I was a wedding portrait photographer, I tended to shoot only with primes. But with travel, I tend to use the 24-70 and the 70-200 as kind of my two main go-to lenses. Because what happens when you're in a career like mine where you're not shooting the exact same travel thing every time. I'm not, for instance, like a travel photographer who specializes in hotels or who specializes in only portraits of people out on the road. I really kind of do everything. And so I find that the versatility of having the 24-70 zoom and the 70-200 zoom allows me to cover, 80% of what I might ever need to capture as a photographer that does travel. Obviously, for safari, which I talked about earlier, in a country like Tanzania or Kenya or South Africa, I've been to all three. Then you're going to absolutely need something more than a 200 millimeter zoom. You're going to need a 400 is a really good lens to have on safari. But those two lenses are usually my go-to, and it's Sony right now. But shout out to Fuji and Olympus because they're really doing great things with mirrorless cameras, and I do love both of those guys. So always have to mention them and give them some love.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go back to travel.
Christelle, I love it. I could talk about that forever, so it works.
I want to travel with you. Take me. Do you need an assistant? I'm yours.
I get asked that question every week of my life.
No.
Yeah, you can serve the drinks on the private flying, Christelle. And...
I know, we're not joking. Do you ever do food photography? Where you travel? Okay.
Yeah. I think that food is one of the ways that you get to know a place and really understand a culture. And I think if you aren't trying the local cuisine and trying whatever a country is famous for, you're really missing out on a big part of the story. I think all the way back to when I was in Turkey and there was a dish with, a yogurt sauce and some, I think it was like paprika and maybe some red pepper on the top. And I think there was pasta underneath, maybe like almost a ravioli. And why the term for it is escaping me now, but I don't really feel like I understood Turkey until I had that specific dish. It's not a dish that you find everywhere all over Turkey, but it's very specific to one of the regions that I visited. And that's always a memorable dish to me because I thought that Turkey was, baklava and other things. And there are a lot of countries that have baklava, but not every country has this particular dish. And so I think that's a very, very important part of the story. And I think you should always be capturing that if you're trying to communicate the story of a place. I am an eater with some allergies. I can't have seafood or fish. So that means a lot of countries' kind of main dish is often off limits to me, but I then just try to have other things. I try the local beer, the local liquor, the local, what are the vegetables like in that country? And, how do they do meats and things? So I just try to get creative with the other things that I can eat and always ask a lot of questions, always take notes if I can. And I'll still take photos of seafood so that people back home who could eat that can see what it's like. So yeah, absolutely. Food photography is a big part of travel for me.
So, I'm going to take it somewhere between the two.
Okay.
If somebody was looking to start to become a travel photographer, I think this is what would your advice be to them, and what would you say is the best career progression sort of thing, so that they can end up getting onto private jets and the like, and taking photographs all over the world and that kind of stuff? What would your advice be to somebody who wants to be, assuming they've got the talent to do that?
Yeah.
What would your advice be? How can they break into that?
I think the number one thing is that you should never expect someone to pay you to take photos and be a photographer if you aren't already a photographer.
Yeah.
And that might sound counterproductive. But the point is, if you don't have your own portfolio or website that you own, that's either your name or a brand name you've made up. If there isn't something you own online where you're showcasing your work, don't rely just on social media. As great as Instagram is, as great as all of social media is, that's not enough of a calling card to get in the door for any real serious work. If you don't have your own portfolio online that you pay to host, or that, you host through a CMS and have your own privatized URL, I think it's going to be harder and harder to break into photography because there's so much competition now. And so many people want to do this job that unless you're really differentiating yourself in that way, I think it's going to be harder and harder. I think that's something you really have to commit to. And so start where you live. Start where you can already go right now, even during the pandemic. I've photographed all kinds of things in Los Angeles while we've only been able to stay here in California. And not as much as I should have, in fact. But I did some. And I went back into my archives and I published things from before the pandemic began. It's very important to already be a photographer wherever you are before you expect people to then be putting you on a plane and flying you to these destinations. And also, I think there's a lot of work to be garnered being the photographer right where you are. I think more and more tourism boards and travel brands are saying, what are the local voices that we can hire that already live in the destination we want to talk about? And so there's also a lot of work to possibly be had right where you live. And you have to prepare yourself for that by already being who you want to be paid to be.
Absolutely. Kirsten, where can our friends and viewers find you online?
Well, it's really easy. My name, KirstenAlana.com, is one of my 2 URLs. So it's right there, KirstenAlana.com. And then also KirstenAlanaPhotography.com. So both of those 2 websites are really good ways to start to get to know me. And I'm Kirsten Alana on all social media. So that's really easy too. Just my name.
Fabulous. Tim, do you have a final question for us?
No, I don't. Well, actually, I mean, there's so many questions I could ask, but I think it's probably best if people message Kirsten personally through every channel possible to ask, what's the best camera? What's the best place you need? How can we picture a zebra in the Serengeti? Those kind of questions.
Absolutely. My DMs are always open. You can email me too. Contact me anytime.
Yeah. So thanks very much for being on the show. And there should be a subscribe thing appearing somewhere on YouTube for people who are watching the replay somewhere. I'm never entirely sure. I need to actually remember. I think it's probably somewhere over where Kirsten's head is on the outside. So thanks everybody, and we will talk to you guys next week.
Thank you, Tim and Kirsten.
This is terrifying for me.
I've made more money in the last 3 years than I did in the previous 7.
Cliche shit, you know.